Kia ora and welcome to this nutrition chat covering the topic of gluten. My name is Charisse. I'm the nutritionist for Harbour Sport. First of all, what is gluten? Gluten is a fraction of other proteins found in some grains. The protein has a different name depending on the grain, but collectively they're known as gluten. It's found in wheat, rye, barley, and there can be some in oats, though technically it's not the same protein. It's also found in flours, sauces, baked goods and cereals that use these grains. We'll cover more of this in the label reading part. Oats have a slightly different protein than the other three, and some people can tolerate oats. However, they are often grown and processed in the same places as the wheat, rye or barley, and so can have some cross-contamination. It's also been found that people who have celiac disease, which is an allergy to gluten, can have symptoms and reactions to the protein avenin in oats, so shouldn't have them. Why is it a problem? It's becoming more and more common for people to investigate having a gluten-free diet, and a lot more is known about it than in years past. And we covered this a little in the session on food sensitivity and intolerance. Some people might find they have digestive upsets, such as bloating, gas, discomfort, and they may have things like a worse condition of eczema or asthma when they do have gluten. This can be due to a sensitivity to the gluten protein, or it might be a sensitivity to one or more of the grains itself. There's also a condition called celiac disease, which is where the body mounts an immune response, an allergic reaction to the gluten protein, and this causes pain and digestive upsets, including vomiting and diarrhea, and it also over time causes damage to the intestine due to the effects of the body reacting to it. And this can cause nutrient absorption problems over time. As I said, going gluten-free is a lot more common now. A lot of people do it for lifestyle choices. Some people do it for to ease physical complaints, and some people may do it as part of trying to lose weight. But there are some things to consider. So the downsides are that there's potential to have increased consumption or intake of salt and sugar and fat. And the reason for this is gluten plays a pretty crucial role in the way that foods taste and feel in our mouth and how they function as a food. And when that's removed, those things need to be mimicked by other ingredients. So sometimes it's met with having more fat and sugar to produce the same effect. Another downside of going gluten-free or removing the foods that have those glutens is you can miss out on essential nutrients. One of them being fibre, but also some of the B vitamins that are found in grains. It can be difficult to manage in social situations if you really need to be completely gluten-free. It can be limiting in what you can eat, and some people find it a bit uncomfortable to ask about the food or make a fuss. They feel like they're making a fuss. It's not that they are, but they feel like they are, and it can be a bit tricky. Another thing to consider is that some gluten-free replacement products can be very, very expensive. So one example is a normal loaf of bread made with wheat flour is around about $3 to $5. But for a higher end kind of brand. For a gluten-free loaf, the minimum you would pay is $5 for a very small loaf, but it can be up to $8 or $10 for a loaf of bread, gluten-free loaf of bread. And they're very small loaves, so they don't go very far. Of course, there are benefits to going gluten-free, otherwise people wouldn't be doing it. The first is that if you really are having physical ailments, particularly with digestion, it can improve those gut symptoms. It can also improve inflammation conditions for some people. By having to check for whether something is gluten-free, you become more aware about your food, understanding what's in it. And as I said, some people do choose to go gluten-free as part of weight management because it can reduce the amount of highly refined carbohydrate foods that you are eating, like bread and baked goods and things like that. And if you're taking those out of your diet, you're naturally going to have less calories. So one of the cautions is that removing gluten from your diet without investigation may make it harder to diagnose if there is something else going on. So one of the things we talked about in the food sensitivity session is that some people will remove a food from their group and their symptoms improve. And so then they associate that that must have been the cause, but it could be something else altogether. And so, as with the food sensitivity, it's not a good idea to take out a food group from your diet without consulting your GP or a dietitian that specialises in that area, because something else might need to be investigated. And also, if you are wanting to have a test for celiac disease, which is the immune condition, that can only provide a result if there's enough gluten in the diet, because the first test is a blood test that shows raised markers in the blood if the body is reacting to gluten. So if there's no gluten there, those markers won't show up, and it can be really difficult to diagnose. The other caution is that grains serve an important part of our diet with vitamins and minerals and fibre, and it's important to have enough variety. So unless you need to remove gluten, foods containing gluten from your diet for some of these physical reasons, then I would say just try and have as much variety as you can and keep those in there. So for people that do have to be gluten-free, either for sensitivity or for diagnosed celiac disease, how do you find out what is gluten-free? It can be pretty daunting to begin with if you haven't had to do this before, if it's new, or if you have family or friends that have just recently started on this diet and you're not sure how to support them. The first thing is to check for this label. So any product sold in New Zealand that's been certified by the New Zealand and Australian Celiac Society and has been found to be gluten-free can have this label. And that has been robustly tested to have no detectable gluten of more than 5 parts per million. And so they're pretty robustly tested and audited regularly, like randomly audited, but it's not a compulsory logo. It's something that companies choose to have. So you can still have gluten-free foods that you won't find this label on. More often, this label is found on foods that are in specialty health stores or some parts of the supermarket. But that's not to say that there's other food in the supermarket that's gluten-free, but you just need to do a bit more investigation and detective work. So the other thing, if you don't find the blue label that we just saw, you still need to check labels. So some will just have it written on the front of pack that it's gluten-free or on the back, but still look at the labels and check them. So look first at the part that says down the bottom, it's in bold writing underneath the ingredients list, it will say contains, and it's compulsory for food in New Zealand to have that allergy declaration. So it will say contains gluten or wheat or soy or eggs or peanuts. It will have those common allergens listed. And then you can also look in the ingredients list for things like gluten, wheat, barley, rye or oats. And that will indicate that there's definitely gluten in there. But sometimes it can be a bit hard because it's maybe they're present in less obvious ingredients. So as you can see on the screen there, there's a few other ones that are definitely part of gluten-containing foods. A lot of them come from wheat. Malt usually comes from barley. So it's a good idea to become familiar with what are the foods that have gluten in them, or the different types of grain products that are produced with gluten in them. So once you've gone through that, another clue to look for is words like thickener, starch, modified starch, hydrolyzed protein, dextrin, and glucose derived from whatever. So they may be from another grain. It's becoming more common for thickener and starches to come from things like tapioca starch or potato starch or rice flour or things like xanthan gum or agar. They are used a lot too, but you still need to check because they can come from wheat and have some residual parts of gluten still in there. Underneath the allergen statement that says contains, there's often one that says may contain. And usually that means the food itself might not have gluten, but they can't guarantee it's not present because it's made or processed in the same place as foods that do contain gluten. So it might be a gluten-free food itself, but if it's produced in the same factory as other foods that do have gluten, they can't guarantee that there hasn't been cross-contamination. So they just put that declaration there for people to understand, if they really need to avoid all gluten. So learning to eat gluten-free, particularly for someone with celiac disease, can be challenging to begin with. For someone with celiac disease, even a small amount of gluten can cause problems and have a reaction, and so it needs to be completely avoided. It's worth taking a bit of extra time to become familiar with where gluten might be hiding. So this is just a short list of some foods that likely contain gluten that we might not be aware of. So most beers, because they come from using barley. Soy sauce, yes, it's from fermented soybean, which is gluten-free, but most soy sauces also have wheat in them. There is a gluten-free Vegemite available, but the regular Vegemite and the Marmite are both not gluten-free because they're made from barley. Regular cornflakes and rice bubbles. So cornflakes and rice bubbles by themselves, with nothing done to them, are gluten-free. Corn and rice is gluten-free, but with cornflakes and rice bubbles, they're usually flavored with a little bit of barley malt. Milo is also made from barley malt. Egg and soba noodles, they're often made with wheat flour. So I believe that soba noodles are traditionally made with buckwheat flour, which we'll go into later, and that's gluten-free. But most of the commercial noodles that we find are made with wheat flour. Corn flour is another one that can be a bit tricky because corn doesn't have gluten, but often the packets are wheaten corn flour. So just have a check. Edmonds is a really good brand to declare that it is gluten-free corn flour, as with their baking powder and soda. But it's a good idea to check the other ones. I know Pam's and Edmonds are both really good at having the gluten-free declared on the packet. Ice creams and sweets that might have biscuit pieces or glucose that comes from wheat or barley. So things like cookies and cream ice cream, or chocolate bars like Mars bars and Moros, they often have they have glucose from wheat or barley, so you need to be a bit careful. Lots of sauces and stock powders. They are quite often used as a thickener or a free flow agent to stop the parts of the stock powders from sticking together. Sausages that are pre-cooked, so these are not talking about the raw ones that you get from the butcher that might just be pure meat, but these are talking about the pre-cooked ones, which usually have some flour in it to bind it, and that's quite often wheat flour. There are more available that have maize starch, which is a type of corn, or potato starch, that's becoming more common, or rice flour, but you still need to check. Juice mixes, and that's things like Vitafresh and Raro, the powder ones, but also things like the Barker's lemon and barley cordial. It's got barley in it, there could be some residual gluten. And the last one to think about is snack foods like chips and nuts and bar mixes that have got some flavouring on them, because usually the flavouring has been mixed with some flour to help spread it on the food and to keep it on the food. So that's worth thinking about as well. So all of that, and you must be thinking, what on earth am I going to eat? Well, the great news is that gluten-free products have come a long way in recent years. They're becoming more and more tasty and behaving like other food. And what I said before about gluten having a specific function is that it provides the elasticity to foods like bread and pasta, allowing them to stretch and rise for better texture and taste. So it's not stodgy and dense. So years ago, when gluten-free was not really well known, the gluten-free products that were available were pretty awful. The bread would be like bread, it would taste like sand. You could only eat it toasted. You couldn't eat it as a raw slice or uncooked slice, sorry. And the pasta wasn't much better. But thankfully, things have come a long way. There's also lots of substitutions available to help gluten-free products look, feel, and taste like the original versions. So as I said before, removing gluten means that other things are needed to provide that function. So they use eggs and gums and sometimes more fat. There's also a great opportunity to explore new ways of cooking. So where someone might have had lunches based around bread, so sandwiches, and dinners that might be based around pasta, there's a lot more opportunity to explore how to make those different. And there's heaps and heaps of great recipes, particularly on Healthy Food Guide. And there's lots of opportunities. It can feel very daunting to begin eating gluten-free, but there are loads and loads of options. You're not going to miss out. Another thing to think about is being aware of cross-contamination. So very sensitive people, particularly with celiac disease that need to avoid all gluten, they may benefit from using separate cooking utensils and chopping boards and toast spreads. So your peanut butter and jam and butter and things can have little crumbs left in it. Some people choose to have a separate toaster, or you can get toaster bags which are available at the supermarket for you to put your slice of bread into the toaster without it touching crumbs that might have been left there from previous pieces of bread. So there are lots of options, and it's important to still try and have other grains to make sure that you're getting plenty of fibre in your diet and the vitamins and minerals that come with grains as well. So here are some things to think about, some gluten-free grains and cereal options. So rice, all types of rice are gluten-free, as long as they haven't been flavoured with something that you need to check. All of corn is gluten-free. Some other grains that are less well known, a lot of them come from South American countries or African countries, but they're becoming more popular as we expand, the things that we like to eat. So there's amaranth and sorghum and millet and quinoa and teff are all grains that are gluten-free. Now I mentioned buckwheat before. The name is confusing because it has wheat in the name, but it's not part of the wheat family of grains. It actually comes from the rhubarb family and it's completely gluten-free. So those are all really good grains that you can use in both savoury dishes and sweet dishes. You can cook them up and use it like a salad ingredient, like a pasta salad or a couscous. Instead of using couscous, you could use quinoa or buckwheat as a replacement for those. There's also lots of different gluten-free flours. I would advise, if you're just starting out, to get something like the Health4Ease baking mix, where food technologists have mixed up different gluten-free flours to a good composition, because it can be a bit of a science to get it right, because some of the grains, flours don't behave very well in certain conditions of cooking and baking. So if you're just starting out, it's a good idea to try one of the mixes where they've already worked it out and tested it robustly. But otherwise, there's lots of gluten-free alternatives for flour. So we've got them listed here. Almond meal, which is just finely ground almond. Corn flour, so making sure that it's corn flour, not wheat corn flour. Rice flour, tapioca, cassava, potato, chickpea, quinoa, coconut, buckwheat, sorghum, and amaranth. So there's lots of options. Here's some tips for going gluten-free or having a gluten-free alternative where you're not needing to worry about it. Lots of cake recipes use ground almond meal or a baking mix, as I said. You could make a single wrap into a thin omelette, a single egg to make a thin omelette style wrap instead of a bread wrap. Using herbs and spices instead of prepared seasonings is a great idea. Also making salad dressings with any of the vinegars except malt. So malt vinegar is not gluten-free, but you can use lots of different dressing and just get experimenting with different flavors. You can also use rice paper sheets as an alternative to pasta for lasagna or phyllo pastry. There's also lots of different gluten-free noodles available. So the ones called Angel here, which are actually made from, or vermicelli, which is made from mung bean. Those are a good noodle. You can get pad thai noodles are often rice noodles. So there are different options. You just need to have a look at the packets. And finally, managing socially if you're gluten-free can be a little bit daunting and tricky to begin with. So here's just some tips, and it gets better as you go along and become more confident, and also it helps with people who are a bit more understanding and willing to learn more about it. So always ask, don't assume. If you're not sure, just check. It's a good idea if you're going to a restaurant or a cafe to see if you can review the menu online before you go. So at least you know what options are available and what you might be able to ask to have changed. So be prepared to ask for modifications. So having the bread left out or having no dressing or something like that. Most chefs these days are very understanding and are much more familiar with how to prepare food gluten-free than years ago. So a lot of people are much more aware of it and willing to make those modifications. And if it's a dinner or a lunch or a gathering with friends or family, offer to take a dish that you know that you can eat so that you're not stuck with just eating fruit or vegetable slices. So take something interesting that you know you like to eat and that you can eat. So as I mentioned earlier, there's loads of great gluten-free recipes on the Healthy Food Guide, and as well as thousands of other recipes and pieces of advice written by experts. We use this resource extensively at Harbour Sport, and we offer it for a discounted subscription rate of $19 for 12 months. So if you are interested, please let us know and we can help you get set up with that. Thanks for listening to this presentation. If you have any questions, please get in touch with us at nutrition@harboursport.co.nz. Thanks for listening.